When trying to think of the best way to address the idea of chemtrails, I thought it best to look at it from the point of view of a believer in chemtrails, a chemtrailer if you will, and investigate the reason for this belief. So why do people think that there's something sinister and secretive going on in our skies? One of the most prevalent ideas seems to be that contrails have changed since the mid to late 90s, generally in that there are more of them and that they last longer now or persist. Although dates vary as to when the change happened, suffice it to say most chemtrailers would agree that since sometime in the 90s the sky has become filled with more and more persistent condensation trails behind planes. They generally explain this by concluding that something has been added to the exhaust of commercial airliners to account for this increased contrail coverage. So have contrails changed in frequency and persistence since the 90s? And if so, what factors could account for these changes? First, it should be noted that the history of contrails goes back to 1919, and persistent contrails were observed as far back as World War II, being a phenomenon of great concern to pilots trying to remain hidden from the enemy. A theory of contrail formation was developed in 1953 by H. Appleman, a modified version of which we can still use today to predict contrail formation. Scientific investigations of the nature, consistency, and effect of contrails began soon afterwards and have persisted to this day. The most obvious possible cause of an increased frequency of contrails would be an increase in air traffic. This is, in fact, exactly what we find. Air traffic has seen a steady rise since the advent of commercial air travel back in the 1950s in the US and around the world. This diagram, centered around flights from Paris, shows a clear increase in flights in the last 30 years. Or compare domestic US flights by United Airlines in 1993 and then in 2004. I created this graph of total January departures in the US from 1996 to 2011. I used January because it had the most data points, and it shows a marked increase after 1998. So we can reasonably conclude that there are more planes in the air now than back in the mid-90s. We should therefore expect there to be some increase in contrails. But to this degree? Surprisingly, the answer appears to be no. To understand the reason for this, we need to look at the difference between modern plane engines and their predecessors, and the modifications to Appleman's theory of contrail formation that I mentioned earlier. What are the factors affecting contrails? A change in any of these factors affects an aircraft's capability of producing a contrail. Here are Appleman's original figures. You can see a difference between planes of different bypass factors. The higher the bypass factor, the more efficient the engine. Work by people like Reinhold Buser and Ulrich Schumann in the last 2 decades has revealed a startling difference between modern aircraft engines and their predecessors and their effect on contrail formation. A major difficulty of doing research in contrails is that your medium of experimentation, our atmosphere, is constantly changing and can be drastically different over a span of merely meters or seconds. And so even using the same plane on the same day could give you wildly different results. Working off the idea that increased sulfur in fuel could lead to a change in contrail formation, they ingeniously used a twin-engine plane and filled one with high sulfur fuel and one with low sulfur fuel, and watched from a spot plane for any differences between the two engines. This allowed them to be able to discount basically all other factors of contrail formation and focus on the fuel. They used the same methodology to test the difference between modern aircraft engines and those built in the decades prior. This time, rather than 2 different fuels at the same time, they used 2 different planes at the same time. A Boeing B-707 built in 1968 and an Airbus A340 built in 1998 were similarly outfitted and then flown in formation wing to wing during ascent and descent and observed from a chase plane. The German scientists found that the newer and more efficient A340 developed contrails at a lower threshold altitude than did the B-707. This means that with the more efficient, lower polluting aircraft engines that were introduced in the early 1990s, aircraft exhaust essentially got colder and wetter, quote, and hence contrails form at higher ambient temperatures and over a larger range of altitudes. This is why people think they have seen more and different contrails since the mid-1990s. It's because they have seen more and different contrails since the mid-1990s. And when you say that contrails didn't look like this when you were a kid, you're right. But just not for the reason you think you are. With increased air traffic around the world and more efficient engines in place, we should expect it.